Okay, good morning, everyone. Just before I say anything, we do have our campaign today for those who are not aware, and for those online, I've just posted a link to my personal team. We desperately do need more space in order to accommodate everything we're trying to do. We're short of space, but it's a constant balancing act to fit everything in. Shabbos morning, during the evening, so please do donate generously. And for those who follow on YouTube, I'll put a link in also there if you wish to, if you're able to donate. We do desperately need that space to allow us to carry on doing more Torah, more tefillah, more pastoral care, more chesed, more programming, etc. Okay, so we were speaking about the traditions from Aristotle, Plato's, which date ultimately back to Socrates, though we know less about what he said and what was from his students. I mentioned last time that the version that sort of arrived in the Jewish world in the most significant way was a blend of Aristotle and Plato, due to confusion within the Arab tradition that mediated the arrival of these ideas into the Jewish world, mixed in with what's often referred to as Neo-Platonism, in other words, the Chedushim of the later philosophers, some Roman thinkers and then Arab thinkers, which they sort of molded or melded into Plato's thought. But either way, this sort of composite, imaginary version of Neo-Platonism, Aristotelian Neo-Platonism is the technical term for this, is what Jews confronted. The second thing we went into, which created a reasonable amount of discussion and thought, was my claim that to a greater degree than we can imagine, the language of Greek philosophy has framed Jewish conversation ever since and given us a vocabulary to have that conversation. So even amongst those who distance themselves from philosophy, certainly amongst those who use philosophy explicitly, this is the case. But even amongst those who distance themselves from philosophy, in a sense, in order to argue with philosophy, you still need to use philosophical terms, and it's become almost impossible to think about or speak about these ideas without slipping into the language of philosophy. Not to say that there aren't other ways of thinking, and not to say that all Jewish thinkers buy into philosophy, and not to say that there weren't consideration of these ideas and ideals well before the spread of Greek philosophy. But once Greek philosophy arrived, it provided such a convenient and helpful way of thinking about things, and molded to such a degree the very language we use, that we've in a sense been unable to escape from that ever since. And even those who disagree on a very fundamental level with philosophy and philosophical reasoning as a way of arriving at truth, nonetheless are sort of caught using the language of philosophy, and we discussed that at length, so I don't want to go through this again. What I would like to do is discuss several ways in which the legacy of Plato, Aristotle, has been significant for now on the thinking of the philosophers, those who do engage with philosophy, though again, I think we'll see that even those who don't find the language useful. And I would like to look in depth at one or two of the ideas, and then in more superficially at a vast array, maybe 5 or 6 ideas that Plato dealt with, or Aristotle, Plato dealt with, and that Jewish thinkers have used ever since. The first idea that I would look at in depth is something called Platonic idealism. And the idea behind this is very, very fundamental, and I think gives us a sort of whole different way of thinking about life. It's not explicitly spelt out in the Rambam, for example, in Moreh Nevuchim. Nonetheless, it pervades so much of Neo-Platonic and Platonic thought. And the broad brushstroke idea behind this is that when we think of a physical object in front of us, Plato argues that we should see this as a mere physical copy, a pale shadow at that, of something more real that exists behind it. And this sounds very mysterious, and it is used by the mystics also, and this is why I'm starting with this idea, because it's a philosophical idea, but one that lends itself to mysticism also. And I want to just try and explain this concept a little bit. It's something that I use so much of the time in this room when I'm giving these series previously when we were looking at philosophy. It almost pervades the way I express ideas, and it gives us a very helpful framework of thinking about so much in Judaism, though fundamentally it's not a Jewish idea, it's a Platonic idea, it's an idea from the Greek philosophers. And he says that when I talk about a table, if I say to you, I'm going to, I went home and I put the shopping down on the table. When we refer to this a table, what table do we mean? When I say this is a table, if you ask me what is this, Dayan Zobin, I say this is a table. When I say this, and I'm pointing to physical object, and say it is a table, what is this a table that I'm referring to? What's it made of? Is it made of wood or metal or plastic? How many legs does it have? When I say, tables, a table is a useful device. What a useful utensil. What are the features of this a table that I'm referring to? This table that exists. What color is it? How many legs does it have? What are its dimensions? And the answer is none of those. It's a concept of table. So what Plato points out is that humans are profoundly conceptual. We navigate concepts very easily. And in some sense, these concepts seem to exist. Now, when it comes to a table, where does this concept exist? And does it exist independently of human creativity? We can perhaps wonder. But what happens when we talk about more abstract ideals? So in maths, we'll talk about a circle. Now, a circle has never existed in the real physical world. A perfect circle has never existed in the real physical world. If you draw a circle with your compass, it's an approximation of a circle. If you were to drill down, if you were to look at it in microscopic detail, you would see it slightly varies from being a circle. A circle has a feature that the line drawn is equidistant all the way around from the center point of the circle. It would inevitably differ from that by a matter of micromillimeters for sure. Could we imagine the reality of a real circle existing anywhere in the universe? Well, actually, no, because if we go down to a quantum level, it's going to still be chunky. It'll still consist of atoms. So where is the circle that mathematicians deal with? And the answer is it's a concept. It exists in Platonic language. It's a form. It's a concept that exists. And yet, when in a sense, we humans easily navigate that conceptual world in more easily in some ways than we navigate the physical world. A small child, when they ask, what is this? And I say this is a chair or a cup, is demonstrating how profoundly conceptual we human beings are. Because this physical object, they don't feel that they are able to grasp, to conceive of. And yet, as soon as I say, this is a cup, this is a chair, they understand it, they relate to it. That means that we are, more than we notice, abstract minds, abstract intelligences that wander the realm of ideas at the same time as we concurrently live in a sort of physical world. We only ever encounter physical objects, and yet all of them are in some ways shadows or pale reflections of something deeper that lies behind them. And when we talk about ideas, we don't really have a way of expressing them other than using physical imagery. And yet we know we mean something so much more than that. Even as I'm talking about the ideas, and I say, when we grasp an idea, I can only use the language of physical contact, of grasping something, of taking hold of something. Let me give you a concrete example. Give you? Am I handing something to you? Am I giving you something? Is it concrete really? There's no way we have of speaking about ideas without slipping into physical imagery. And yet what we mean is something so much deeper behind it. Let's just analyze that sentence. There's no way, a path, without slipping into physical imagery. And yet that's the only thing we can do. Is it doing? In order to grasp the idea behind it? Is it behind it? So where's the it that it's behind? Is it behind? Is there spatial use at all? So we're stuck Plato's saying, we're stuck chained to a physical world, and yet we understand, we conceive, we touch, we meet, we encounter. These are all just physical words, ideas, concepts that exist behind the physical reality that we're talking about, and that in many cases have a reality to them independent of the physical world and whether these objects actually exist. The fact that there is no physical circle in the world doesn't mean that the concept of circle doesn't exist. If the whole universe would implode or if we would happen to live in a universe in which there isn't four of anything, which happens to be a universe in which there's only three, a very small universe in which there's only three atoms, there's not four of anything, would the concept of the number four not exist? It seems to have an independent existence, independent even of the physical world. If the whole of space would shrink on itself, would the concept of a circle not exist? Now, how far you take this idea is a matter of debate. Is this only when it comes to mathematical ideas, or even things which are connected to spatial concepts, or maybe more than that? If all cats would go extinct, would there not be the concept of a cat? Can we not study the biology of a dodo, even though there is no dodo in existence? And maybe even human beings, right? Julius Caesar, he has ceased to exist physically. But when we're studying history, he's a concept that exists. So can a human being become a concept? So how far we take this is a fascinating idea. But certainly when it comes to mathematical ideals, mathematical forms, this is a profound idea. And maybe when it comes to moral ideas, the concept of kindness, the morality of kindness, an act of kindness, does this cease to exist? Is this something temporal? Where would it disappear to? If I help a little old lady cross the road with her shopping, in what way would that act of kindness cease to exist with the passage of space and time? There's something that seems to be eternal around these ideals, and the fact that they don't exist in space and time, and can perhaps never exist in space and time. There's a reason that there can't be a perfect circle or a perfect square or a perfect line or anything like that in existence. So this is a concept that there's a reality to the realm of ideas, and in some way, paradoxically, more real than actual physical objects that exist. Because physical objects that exist have a particular expression in time-space. This table is plastic and with four legs. It's not a six-legged table. It's not an eight-legged table. It's not made of wood. It's not made of marble. It's not made of metal. And it only would exist for a certain amount of time, and then eventually it will wear out and it will cease to exist. And yet the concept of table seems to be eternal, seems to be immortal, seems to be above time and space. And Plato gave this famous analogy of the cave, of a child trapped in a cave, chained in the cave. The child behind the child is chained such that the entrance to the cave is behind them, and they can only look at the back wall of the cave. And the sun shines through into the cave, and all they can see on the black wall is the shadows of people and things and objects walking around behind them. So it's almost like a film projector projecting onto the wall of the cave, and yet all they can ever see is the shadows. And from the shadows, the child has to speculate and work out what the real world looks like. And this is Plato's famous allegory of the cave, the idea that we are these children chained to the cave, never able to turn our head and look behind us and see the real world, only ever to see the shadows moving on the screen, which is at the back of the cave, and yet somehow from them able to work out and consider and conceive of these ideas. And in reality, we humans are amazing beings, because we walk on the physical earth, and yet our minds soars and lives in the world of ideas in a very profound way. In many respects, we live more in the world of ideas than we live in the physical world, and yet we only conceive of ourselves. Conceive, again, vision, only in the physical world we can use. We can only conceive of ourselves as living in the world of ideas, in the world of concepts, in the world of Platonic forms, of the world of ideals. This is an idea that needs reflection. It needs thought. Again, reflection, another example of this problem over here that we have, that we don't have a language to use, a vocabulary to use. I think it's a very, very profound idea. It's an idea that's an enormous amount of impact on Western philosophy, on the philosophical tradition. I hope you can see why, on the one hand, it's illuminating again, but on the other hand, and as a philosophical idea, needs a lot of thought and a lot of work, and also, in a sense, has a mysterious imagery to it, because it's sort of telling us that there's this intellectual world, conceptual world, ideal world that exists, that somehow isn't physical. And you can see how this can begin providing an interesting and useful way of thinking about Judaism, revelation, mystic. You can see how the mystics can latch onto this idea also, and how it can alter permanently our vocabulary of thinking about concepts. So, for example, we humans are embodied consciousnesses. We can never meet an idea directly. We can't live in the world of concept. We are chained to the cave. We can only see physical objects, and yet we so profoundly from them extrapolate and live in the world of concepts. We have a concept of cup. We have a concept of table. Certainly, we have mathematical concepts or moral concepts that we live in. We just finished the point, and then I'll answer the point. Could we conceive, or could we imagine, of a disembodied consciousness, of a being that lives in the world of forms? Well, the Rambam speaks about Malachim, angels, as being a seichel nivdol, a detached consciousness that lives indeed in the world of forms. And you can see how this sort of ties very nicely into the concept of a spiritual world. And really, when you think about us human beings, we walk amongst men, and yet we live amongst angels. That's what it means to be a human being. And that sort of beautiful dichotomy at the heart of human existence emerges very nicely from Plato's ideas and from this sort of language of Neo-Platonism. So it gives us, when we're trying to think about eternity, it even gives us, this is very philosophical, but even gives us, in a sense, a vocabulary to think about God himself as when we say Hashem has absolute existence. The Rambam in the beginning of his Mishnah Torah lays out really in philosophical language, by the way, the very essence of Emunah. He's using the language of philosophers, but the core idea he's saying is not a philosophical idea. It's an idea that's at the basis of Emunah. It's a good example of how the language of philosophy has taken over our way of thinking, but it's saying an idea that existed previously. He says several things about God. He says he's the first cause, a philosophical term that we'll come on to with Plato in a few minutes. But then he also says that he has absolute existence, as opposed to us who are contingent existence, meaning to say his existence is not dependent on anything else. It's absolute existence. He's fundamentally existent. We can't conceive of his non-existence. Whereas our existence is contingent, it's dependent on something, and so he elaborates, dependent on God himself. This vocabulary, this philosophical vocabulary, gives us a sense of what absolute existence means in a borrowed way again. In a certain sense, we can think of the number 4 as having a more absolute existence than 4 of anything actually existing. This cup can cease to exist, but the concept cup can less cease to exist. 4 of anything can cease to exist. The universe can implode and there can be nothing, and yet the concept of 4 would seem to exist beyond that. And therefore, you can almost build a hierarchy of these sorts of Platonic forms in which we can imagine, you can imagine a universe in which concept Julius Caesar didn't exist, but a biological species, a cat, seems more fundamental than that, perhaps. And then certainly when you come on to circles, they seem yet more fundamental, but even they are somewhat contingent on space-time, on there being something spatial. But a circle seems more of a concept than that. Numbers seem yet more conceptual than that, more to have an absolute existence even than circles. And yet numbers themselves are dependent on the concept of plurality, the idea that there's more, that there's still something. God himself is absolute unity, so he's above all these features. He is the concept of all concepts, the ideal of all ideals. So these ideas that reframe our ability to think and conceive in a very, very profound way. There's more I want to say about that, but there's a number of questions, and I know what I'm saying is if one isn't familiar with these ideas, it's quite hard to understand. Yeah.
Is this idea in the Brahma Bashayatsa, but Mathila says, well, you've got the spiritual and you've got the physical facing each other, and when it's a Mathila, it's this concept of spirituality, but there's a physical nature.
Anyone who engages in philosophy or psychology or mysticism or Kabbala, or simply reflects on the wonders of human existence, at some point encounters the core idea here of in your language, of mafdi lasos, that human existence is wondrous. As you sort of reflect on the mystery of our own existence, and this, by the way, is something people should do. This isn't just, I don't want this just to be a philosophical idea. This is, to take a little bit of time and just introspect at the wonder that there's a me here, that I exist. And more than that, the consciousness and the problem of consciousness, that consciousness seems profoundly non-physical, and yet we all experience it. And I will again get to consciousness later. You can't help but come up with mafdi lasos, with this wonder of we're somehow physical yet spiritual beings. All I'm arguing is that the language of philosophy when we talk about ideas, we often use, particularly classic ideas, we often use terminology that doesn't mean that much to us, and we don't really know what it means. We have a vague intuition of it. And all I'm arguing is that philosophy sometimes can help up our intuition one notch. It can make things a little clearer. So we talk about an neshama, soul. Now, what is this soul? What do we mean by the soul? We have an intuition around it. It's something about the inner me, the real me, but spiritual me, but so consciousness is a convenient vocabulary to the me that experiences, the inner me that's the experiencer, gives us something to latch onto that approaches what we mean by the concept of soul. Talk about something being spiritual. This much else is the classic idea that we humans are physical and spiritual. But what exactly do we mean by spiritual? So again, this sort of Platonic idealism gives us a one extra tool in the toolkit of trying to understand these ideas. It's that we live in the world of Platonic ideals. We're tied to this cave, and yet somehow we have minds that can exist in the real world. When we talk about the spiritual world being more real than the physical world, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to understand. What do you mean it's more real? This is real. And yet Plato pointing out that even from a philosophical point of view, leave aside revelation, that there's a more real world lying behind our world, and that somehow our physical world is a pale reflection of this real world that lies behind it. These are helpful ideas for Jews to think about, and you can see why Jews that engage with this sort of greedily absorbed this and found it suddenly it became a very useful way to think about things. And I want to tie this into one other article of vocabulary that we mentioned, which you'll find endemic to Jewish thought all over the place, including in the language of the Mikobolim, and yet really is language developed from this way of thinking, which is choma and surah, the form and the raw material. Now, can you distinguish? It's a sort of intuitive distinction that we talk about the whole time. This table, the raw material is wood, and yet the form is a table. But on a more profound level, when we think about it, where is this form? What is this form that the Torah has, that the table has? We almost imagine a form somehow settling on the physical object. And this is Platonic ideal. There's the form table, the concept table. What's the concept table? It's around functionality, it's around purpose, it's around shape. Form is a borrowed language again. It's another example, borrowed. It's another example of how we only have physical words to talk about concepts. Form, when we say form, we picture embossing, stamping a shape on something. But when we say the form of a table on a block of wood, we don't just mean the physical shape embossed on it, we mean the functionality, the concept. But where is this functionality? What is it? Again, this gets us back to the world of Platonic ideals. Yeah. Yes.
Whether it ties to Rambam, suggest perhaps that angel
Okay. So the Rambam speaks about angels in a number of ways. He points out, and this is one way of thinking about angels, that that angel simply means a messenger of Hashem, and therefore the rules of nature, the winds, it's really a posuk. Hashem makes the winds into his angels. The idea that the forces of nature, the laws of nature in some ways are malachim. But elsewhere the Rambam speaks about malachim as tzcholim nivdolim. I don't know the classical Arabic, but that's the translation we received from the Ibn Zobin family. Tzcholim nivdolim, abstract intelligences. This week on Wednesday, we were in Oxford, and we went to the Bodleian Library and had the privilege of seeing a very early copy of the translation of the Nevuchim produced by the provincial scholars who were Arabic speakers who wanted to translate, due to demand, the Nevuchim of the Rambam into Hebrew, so that the other Jews in Provence and then ultimately in Ashkenaz in the north could understand it. And Ibn Tabuns were not just translators; they were fundamental in creating this vocabulary in Hebrew of the Arabic philosophical terms that in themselves were created as translations of the Greek terms. And the term that we now have in Lashon HaKodesh to define this idea is malachim cholim nivtolim, abstract or removed, nivdal, like Havdalah, separate intelligences. They're not intelligences that are embodied, but they're intelligences which are disembodied, that are somehow abstract. They're just ideas that move in the realm of ideas. And we humans have a degree of we can wander that world in some very limited way, even though we are very much not Secholim Nivdolim. We're not, when the Rambam talks about encountering a malach and says this takes place, he says Yaakov can't wrestle with the physical malach. Malachim can't have physical form. We spoke about this years ago, perhaps in our Sunday morning series. Then the Rambam says it's simply not possible. It's not, a malach isn't the sort of thing that can have a physical form. The way we would think about it now in this language is it'd be like me saying, what color is the number 4? Or can Hashem make a miracle and give the number 4 a body. It's not that Hashem can do anything. Miracles aren't the problem. It's that the concepts don't fit together. They're not concepts that can. Number 4 can't have a body. It's not the sort of thing that can have a body. So when we read the story of the Malachim appearing to Avram, and the Malachim are embodied somehow and eat, they're just not the sort of thing that can be embodied. They're not. It doesn't go together. It's like saying the number 4 becomes embodied, and therefore the Rambam argues that this must be a nevuah, mara nevuah. One way of thinking about prophecy is that prophecy is when your mind moves in the realm of Platonic forms and Platonic ideals. You can see why the Rambam, even though the Rambam distinguishes and not to, between prophecy and other forms of reasoning, nonetheless, he's okay with understanding they're all reasoning in some shape or form. Don't think of nevuah, prophecy, as necessarily being something completely different to whenever you wander in the realm of abstract ideals. It's a different order of magnitude, but it's not necessarily qualitatively a completely unrelatable to experience. As we think about the concept of nevuah, it's not just it's something beyond our imagination for sure, and it's a different order of magnitude. But we can again have a realm of relating to it. You know, many scientists, many mathematicians describe. You can read their memoirs. They describe the discovering mathematical formulae as they almost experience them almost a mysterious experience or a meditative experience of wandering through the landscape of numbers and encountering features and behaviors and properties of numbers. Again, we can only use physical language, properties of numbers, features of numbers. Many in science, there's a whole, in the philosophy of science, there's a whole discussion as to what degree a law of science is a created artifact by us, invented by us humans, or it's merely us encountering something that's in some way pre-existent. So this sort of idea that Plato triggered remains a very live and hot issue in philosophy to this day. To what degree are we merely categorizing things, but there's no reality to it, or to what degree is there an underlying reality that lies behind it? And one way of thinking about Malachim is that they are abstract intelligences. By the way, even words shift meaning, and intelligence is itself not a great word for this. It's more than just being intelligent. It's abstract consciousness is maybe a better word than that. It's almost a conscious lived experience. Sorry, David.
That these concepts didn't exist in Judaism until Greek philosophy came along, or only that we didn't have the language to express it. But even if we're saying that, how do we reconcile that with the idea that Hebrew is Lashon Kodesh, which in theory therefore should be all embraced?
We had a language to talk about these things, but as you shift language, that shifts the way you think about things in subtle ways also. Whenever you translate something, it gets altered. And again, I can't emphasize enough, I don't want to go on about this, but every word we're using, altered, right? Changed, change, all these are physical terms, borrowed terminology. So there clearly is a difference between talking about a soul and seichel nivtol, a disembodied in consciousness. What exactly is the difference? Separate discussion, I don't want to go into, but there's a different feel to it, right? It brings something different. In essence again, another physical word. In essence, they're the same idea in a very to some degree or other, but clearly something is altered by using the language of the Greeks. In the opponents of the Rambam, that part of their very argument against philosophy is that you are taking Kodesh ideas and Greekifying them, you're Hellenizing them, you're ruining them. The supporters of the Rambam are saying, okay, but you're also giving us tools with which we can talk about them and navigate them. One of the reasons why the Rambam aroused such fierce opposition is because of the very kedusha of the ideas he's talking about. If you're learning science and maths, okay, so that gets into the debate about what exactly is the realm of chol studies in a world of kodesh. But if you're altering your very way of thinking about kedusha, that's sacrilegious, that's me'ilah, that's trespass, that's awful. You're corrupting the very essence of Yiddishkeit. And again, I'm not going into that debate. This series is not an attempt to defend Maimonidean, Aristotelian, Neo-Platonism in any shape or form. It's simply stating that to some degree or other, you can't help but slip into using that language once it's been created. It's too useful and too immediate. I want to emphasize again, I'm not suggesting that Hasidic thought or Kabbalistic thought is or isn't fundamentally Greek. I'm simply saying that the means of expressing it has become more than we realize Greek. And once that happens, that has an influence on one's ability to talk about these ideas. Yes.
Can one accept the?
Nice, by the way, to have an online listener live. Welcome to the UK. Yeah.
Thank you. Can one accept the Rambam's approach, his understanding of Plato?
Yes.
But yet ascribe that to the uniqueness of the human brain without going into supernatural concepts that, meaning can the atheists still approach the Rambams and Plato and accept everything that you're bringing, but say that's just the uniqueness of how the human brain and the synapses work in terms of how we understand things, that you don't have to go to angels and to go to concepts that can't be measured?
Okay, so 2 points. I'm going to break your question down into 2 points because it's a very, very fundamental question. The question was, can an atheist go with Plato's ideals without and just understand these as concepts of synapses of the human brain? That was the question. I want to break this down into 2 points. The first stage is, before we come on to atheism and supernatural and any of those words, is Plato right or wrong? Is it true that there's in some way a reality of a concept of the number 4, or concept table, or concept circle? Again, Plato didn't talk about angels necessarily. I mean, it happens to be he did, but you don't need to talk about angels to discuss these ideas. But the concept, let's talk about mathematical concepts. Do they exist independently? Or is this just that humans classify and categorize things? In which case, it's just these are convenient labels for us to use, and this is just how humans conceive of the universe. Is there a reality behind it? This remains a live debate to this day. It's probable that Aristotle, this is a distinction between Aristotle, the Talmud of Plato, and Plato himself. Plato definitely thought there was an absolute existence. Aristotle spoke more about categorization, either because he disagreed with absolute existence, or because he felt it lends itself to too much messy thinking, and therefore stick to categorization. And this has remained almost one of the most fundamental philosophical divides to this day. I came to philosophy. I was not originally at all well read in philosophy. I went to school where I had a good education in science and maths and history and economics and other things. I then went to Gemara, to Yeshiva, where I focused on Gemara and in the classic Gemara syllabus. And I've ever told the story about my eye. I'll tell you a little bit of Zobin history since we're schmoozing here. I had a great blessing happen to my life, which I was in the yeshiva, and in a piece of plaster, a small piece of plaster, fell off the ceiling as I'm lying in my bed with my eye open, and entered into my eye and slightly damaged my eye. Thank God, I'm short-term damage. And I went to a specialist who, amongst other things, told me I wasn't allowed to read more than 8 hours a day or something like that. I can't remember what the figure was, which was a problem for a yeshiva bacher who wanted to learn for many, many hours a day. And I now had this chunk of time in the evening, which I didn't quite know how to fill. And I decided to explore different shiurim that one around about different interesting topics. And I ended up twice a week in Or Sameach in Yerushalayim, where Rabbi Dr. David Gottlieb taught philosophy to newcomers to Judaism. And I had engaged to some degree with some of these ideas through Michtav Minyan or Odessa. I was always interested in the world of ideas. And in Hasmonin, I've been taught by Dr. Gerber, who used to speak some degree of Michtav Minyan ideas and Machshava and so on. But I used to go to Moshe Shapiro's shiurim, so I dealt very seriously with Machshava, but I never sort of engaged in formal philosophical thinking. And I went for a few months to Rabbi Dr. David Gottlieb's shiurim, which were eye-opening to me, opened up around. And then I began learning Nevuchim very, very seriously. I got better, so I could go back to text. And I discovered this whole world of Nevuchim. And so I came to this through a completely reverse order, in a sense, very much an autodidact. And the Nevuchim opened my eyes up to this whole amazing way of thinking. And I'd always been told, by the way, I'd always heard that the Rambam was very influenced by Aristotle, and I began looking at Aristotle, and the ideas didn't really fit. And then I discovered Plato, and came to my own conclusion. The Rambam was a follower of Plato in a way more than Aristotle. And for several years, I walked around thinking I was probably the only person in the world, nearly, who took Plato seriously, because I didn't know this was a live school of philosophy. But the Rambam I found, this is fascinating. Since then, I became very worried, and I discovered there's a whole school of serious ideas out there. Neo-Platonism, very, very serious live philosophy. And to this day, this remains a subject of debate. Is this messy thinking and really just categorization and just a feature of the human mind? Or is there a reality to concepts? Do they really exist? As Plato writes, I confess my sins today. To me, I don't really understand the other side. It's clear to me that this is a reality. And I don't see this for any mystical reasons or any Jewish reasons. I just think it's messy thinking the other way around. As soon as you categorize something, there's a realm of thought and a realm of ideas, and ideas have existence. They are there. What would it mean to say that in a universe where there happened not to be four of anything, there wouldn't be a concept of four? And then we're left with a very serious question. So where does this concept of four live? What does it mean? And the answer is it's sort of a false question. An idea exists in the realm of ideas. A realm is, of course, only a borrowed terminology. So it sounds mystical that there's a world of ideas there, but it's not. I don't mean as a mystical idea. I mean as a rational idea that concepts are. They exist. The problem is existing as a borrowed language, because by existence we mean physical existence, and I don't mean that concepts have physical existence. Of course they don't. They have conceptual existence. So the problem that the Rambam really belabored over in Moreh Nevuchim in dealing with God, that all human language is borrowed, and when we talk about anthropomorphic language, God's arm, we really mean his strength. He doesn't really have a strength, and he doesn't have a physical body. Really, and this is sort of what the Rambam is saying in this Guide to the Perplexed, is a problem in all human thought. Because we're always grappling with ideas. And to those who ring to Plato's ideas, I'm not taking sides here. What Zobin happens to think about this is negligible when we're talking about a sort of divide in philosophy, a 3,000-year-old debate, 2,800-year-old debate. But the idea that concepts have a reality to them, and again, reality is only borrowed terminology here. It seems to me and to those that find this convincing obvious. So the first part of your question, which is this just a product of the human brain, or is there something behind it? I don't think this is just a product of the human brain. I don't know what that would mean to say the number four. Were there no humans, had humans never been created and never evolved, and there were no conceptual thinkers, would there not be a concept of multiplicity? Would there not be a concept of a circle around? So I don't know what that means, and those that find this idea convincing also don't know what that means. I'm trying to be fair here when I'm saying it. I think it doesn't make sense, but I know there's wise people that think it does. That's the first part. Okay, what can an atheist make of all of this? Do you need to be a mystic or a theist to believe in this? That itself is debatable. There are many Neo-Platonists who aren't mystics in the least, aren't spiritual people in the least, and they still think this makes sense. Just because you believe that in the concept of the number four doesn't mean you have to believe in spooky stuff like angels or gods. And this is the idea of the realm of ideas, of Platonic ideals, of forms, of concepts is one idea. I'm simply saying that it provides a useful tool for us to translate spiritual ideas into. It is the fact that humans have a conceptual existence proof that we are somehow spiritual beings. You get into vocabulary. It's proof that we're somehow conceptual beings, that we exist in the realm of ideas. We're not just physical beings. But where do we go with that? In a way, you can cut out now all of the Platonic stuff, and whatever you hold about it, you can say the fact is we are conscious beings. We're not just physical beings. We have consciousness. There's a me here, and consciousness is a very mysterious thing. How would a physical being be aware? A physical object is just a physical object. We know what humans are. We're just complex arrangements of physical objects, and yet somehow we're capable of interacting with consciousness, with ideas, with experiences. Forget Plato, forget ideas, forget where you put them. Even if these are products of human syntax. So I think this is a knockout blow against what I consider really, really rubbish philosophy, like materialism. The idea we're just material. If you can't measure it in a lab, it doesn't exist. If it's not spatial, it doesn't exist. The sort of extreme nihilistic materialist idea that we're just physical beings and there's nothing else besides that which is physical. I think this is a knockout blow, and I think that's rubbish philosophy. I think it's very, very poor philosophy, the idea that we're just physical beings. My frustration with the Richard Dawkins of the world is to the best of my ability. I don't think this is biased because I happen to be a Maimonides. It's just because he maybe is a great biologist, but he's just a rubbish philosopher. He's pushing a sort of philosophy of materialism, which anyone who's engaged seriously with philosophy knows is dead. It's just not a decent piece of philosophy. Raw materialism is untenable. I want to explain again, and this goes back in essence in some ways to Descartes. I don't want to get into the divide of dualism, monism, and exactly what consciousness is. We'll come to that later, actually, again, in the context of Plato. But the idea that we humans are conscious, it can't be an illusion. Consciousness can't be an illusion. It's the one thing in the world that can't be an illusion, because who would it be who's experiencing the illusion, right? This is Descartes' I think, therefore I am. Again, in modern day vocabulary, it's probably better to say I'm conscious, therefore I am, rather than I think, therefore I am. There's been a shift in meaning. I'm conscious, there's an experiencer here. Who would it be who's having this experience? It's the one thing. If I ask you what's the one thing you can know with certainty, is that you're an experiencer. Even if everything you're experiencing is an illusion, even if you're trapped in some form of virtual reality, even if there's a mad scientist triggering your brain floating in the vat, and there's a mad scientist triggering neurons, even if everything is a dream, who is it who's having the dream? Who is it who's having the illusion? So that the core reality of me being a conscious being is the one and only thing I know. Now I have lots of questions. Is it possible that this is an illusion? Is it possible that all of you are illusions? Is it possible that you don't have consciousnesses, the problem of other minds, and only I have consciousnesses? How do you prove to me that you're conscious? All these are great questions, or maybe not great questions, however you think philosophically about this. But those are where philosophy starts. Those are where the questions start. But the fact of my own conscious existence is not a question. It's the only thing I know. And that's not a material thing. That's by definition an awareness. It's something that we actually don't know how it would interact with materialism. How can this consciousness influence that which is material? How can that which is material influence it? And yet we know it does. It's the only thing that we do know that it does. My consciousness can alter the physical world. Watch. Right? My consciousness is altering the physical world. The physical world alters my consciousness. I'm seeing imagery, and that's creating experiences in me. So the idea that of just material is out. It's history. Is on the rubbish heap of nonsensical philosophical ideas. One second, we are clearly, if anything, if you want to be skeptic and play the sort of extreme skepticism card, I'm not suggesting you should, but if you want to, then you should doubt the material, you should doubt the physical, because however much you measure in the lab, all that could be an illusion. But the act of experiencing yourself as a measurer, that's the one thing that can't be an illusion. So we definitely, I would argue, live in a deeper, more profound way in a non-physical world than a physical world. Again, does that mean emunah? Does that mean spirituality? Does that mean mysticism? Maybe not. But the idea that we're non-physical beings is that materialism is a deluded view of the world. To me, seems concrete. To me, seems ironclad. And once we get there, it certainly opens us to the concept of belief in God and everything else. When I speak to students, the frustration, the difficult conversations are when people have gone down this dead end alley of materialism. They just think like this whole idea of belief and so on is all just spooky and weird and everything. The problem is we live in a spooky, weird universe. We've recognized that there's no way of escaping that. That doesn't mean that everyone has to agree with my version of spooky weird. And obviously there's a big big leap from the fact that I'm conscious to belief in God, or the fact that there's Platonic ideals to belief in God. But there's a much bigger leap away from materialism. If you're in materialism, there's no one to talk to, there's no conversation to be had. Once someone moves away from that, these are helpful in opening up. And now there's a debate philosophically about how far you can go and whether this path of thought inevitably leads to emunah and belief in Hashem and so on. And fine, that's a separate thing. But you can see again why I hope you can see why this provides a very, very useful way of thinking about spirituality and ruchnias. I find it very, very useful educationally, because when you talk to people about souls and gods and angels and malachim, it all sounds very, very weird and very wishy-washy. However, consciousness is something everyone has to think about, and concepts is something everyone has to think about, and it allows a beginning of a vocabulary of what we. I use this in my droshes and my shiurim and everything I use. I talk about kedusha as transcendence. Transcendence means we're going beyond physical existence. So the vocabulary that's developed out of philosophy provides a very useful tool to speak to, certainly to those who are removed from, and all of us to some degree are removed from pure emunah, and maybe even to those who are very deeply immersed in pure emunah. One of the big debates post the Rambam's life was whether we should view Nevuchim, and maybe even the Rambam intended it this way, as merely a kiruv tool. For those who are deep down the wormhole of philosophy, this is the way of putting them back out by giving them a ladder to climb. Or did the Rambam see this as fundamentally useful and so on? Now, I have a personal view as to the answer to that question, but for now, push aside my part, I think Rambam did see Moreh Nevuchim as a fundamentally useful type of spirituality. But however you resolve that debate, it is a fact that this language is a useful way of giving you a ladder, at least, to climb out of a very secular or overly Greek way of thinking about things. Yeah, sorry, amazing.
whether the increasing noise around consciousness, as an AI construct,
Yes.
that would take up a challenge what you were saying about the voice of consciousness.
So very briefly, it is a topic for another day, but I'll just say the question was about AI and so on. I wanted to understand, again, Descartes is also associated with a particular theory of consciousness, dualism. I don't want to go into this particular theory, but the raw sort of concept or idea that consciousness is all I really know about myself, and it's in a sense the one inarguable fact. And yet we don't know what the relationship between physical existence and our brains, our physical matter of which we're made, the meat of which we're made, and where consciousness emerges and how it links to that and how the two interact. That remains a philosophical problem. And it's still in the realm of philosophy, not science. And I just want to explain what that means. And it's been running for 2,000 plus years, this problem. When we say something is a philosophical problem, not a scientific problem, what we mean is that we don't even know what the answer would look like. We don't know what sort of answer could be a candidate for being an answer. If I came running in one Sunday morning and said, guys, amazing breakthrough, we've just discovered which chemical causes consciousness, you ought to look at me and say, we don't know what you mean. Because it's not that we happen not to have discovered. A lot of people that think about these things move into neurology and neuroscience and so on. None of that is getting, this is science, it's not philosophy, it's not getting to the core of the problem of we don't know what could be a candidate for consciousness. The problem isn't that we happen not to have discovered the right neuron or the right chemical, is that we don't know, a table seems not to be conscious, it's just a block. A brain is just lots of blocks arranged in complicated ways, and yet somehow there's consciousness there. Is it an emergent property of physicality? Is it something else? All these questions remain unanswered. There is some exciting and interesting developments in how we might set about answering these questions, but at the moment now, we don't know what an answer would look like. What would be the relationship between the two? I'm happy to give a sort of dedicated mini-series on consciousness and the problem of consciousness, because it is important. But for now, I'll just suffice with that there's no, at the moment now, we don't know what a scientific answer would even look like to this question. It's not the sort of thing that we can see how science can deal with. Okay, is this completely clear to everyone now? Yeah, reasonably clear. Okay, I do think these ideas are important, and I would encourage everyone to do their own reading around this, because I think these are these are quite central ideas. I'll just use the next 5 minutes just to run through a few other Platonic ideas. So yeah. But still post-Plato, I hope. Yeah.
So development of our mathematical understanding starts with the number one.
Yes.
It was the whole point of the year that I did. And the mathematics that we have developed in response to questions that man had. So you had the first thing after number one, you get the fractions. So why are fractions? Why weren't fractions sufficient? And you have to then develop a decimal system.
Mm-hmm.
And so that all these things, development of mathematics is basically trying to solve problems that man had from time at the beginning. So I'm just puzzled by why there be so much. If you look at philosophy as doing the same sort of thing, that the Greeks had these questions they were asking about the world, man had developed, brain had developed, and they're faced with these questions. Why was there so much, or I might be wrong, but within the religion it seems there's so much anti feelings against using Greek philosophical ideas, when it was answering for the Greeks' questions, which had we asked, we would be faced with the same questions.
So if Greek thought and science simply meant, can you give me a pragmatic solution to a problem? I want to get from A to B, and it takes me a lot of time. And if I can invent a wheel, then I'll get there faster. And if I can invent a car, then no one would have a problem with it, right? Those within Judaism who are very distant from Greek thought and science don't have any problems with using light switches. That's not on a functional level, no one has an issue with it. The problem is, and I just mean problem in a borrowed sense, either problem or not problem, but why there's engagement with this is because behind it emerges a school of thought, an underlying series of ideas. And these series of ideas can be potentially problematic for believing Jews. And I'm not saying they are. The Rambam in Nevuchim addresses some of them, and the conversation is carried on. He wasn't the first, he wasn't the last. Rav Saadiah Gaon addresses them, and Moreh in some shape or form addresses them. But for example, one of the axioms almost of science is that we live in a regular universe. Now, it's an axiom. It's an unfounded belief. We can't really prove it, but it seems to work on a pragmatic level. If the universe is indeed just a giant clockwork, a mechanism with completely predictable rules, and let's say, as Newton discovered, if you know the position of the planet now and you know all the forces acting on it, then with 100% precision, he argued, you can predict where it'll be in a year's time, or in 5 years' time, or in 5 million years' time. Then out of that emerges a whole series of implications that you can begin wondering about. Well, if that's the universe, maybe that's what humans are, in which case, who says we have free will or a spiritual dimension? We can turn the clock back and then work out if the planet was here now, then where was the planet 5 minutes ago, and 5 years, and 5 million years ago? And then you arrive at issues of age of the universe, and so it goes on. So it's true that the spur for all these things was presumably physical need, but out of that emerged a whole realm of thought, which you can see at least potentially could conflict with Judaism. Second point I want to make is that it seems that people weren't just motivated by practical needs. It seems there's that within a human being that is fundamentally curious about this world. And we relate to this, and there's no reason to assume that ancient man was any different, or ancient person was any different. We're interested in history even when it doesn't have any practical implications. It's interesting to know where you come from, what your history is. We're interested in the purpose and meaning of life, even though it doesn't have any functional, it's not just a way to invent a wheel and to get from A to B. So it seems there's that within a human being that does strive for meaning and so on. And presumably, as ancient people sat around the fires, they looked at the stars and wondered what they were, and they debated the meaning and purpose of life. And we have, obviously in a very limited way, archaeological evidence of that. So we find that humans buried bodies dated very far back. We find imagery on walls which don't seem to be functional, but seem to have been appreciation of aesthetics. So it seems humans, even in the very ancient world, were recognizing humans aren't just animals, and that there was respect due to bodies and an interest in art and so on. So I think presumably, therefore, and most scientists actually, and mathematicians, when you speak to them, are motivated beyond functionality. They sort of have to come up with functionality in order to get the funding from their paymasters. But it doesn't seem they're really interested in that a lot of the time. They want to discover truths of the universe, and there's no reason to assume that the same way as we seek a truth, ancient people weren't interested in truth with the capital T. Okay, I'll mention one other thing then, given that we're now really out of time, just for the sake of doing one other thing, and the next week we'll run through something I can rush. No, I'm going to stop there and we'll do it next week because I don't want to rush there. I think next week we'll run through, this week was in depth, next week we'll run through Blineda 5-7 ideas, and then just to give you a trace of how wide-ranging Plato's thinking is and the degree to which it interacts with Judaism. Again, for those who are online and live, please do donate. I'll post the link here to our campaign for funding that we desperately need. Thank you very much. Wish you a good day.
Sponsored this year, confused.com.
Thank you very much. Okay, I wish everyone a good day. Thank you.